Hello everybody and welcome to today's ASEN event. We are talking about nation states and reactions to COVID in Europe, and I'm delighted to be joined by the greatest four people since Diocletian set up the Tetrarchy, Sarah Carroll of UCD, Lea David of UCD, Siniša Malešević of UCD, and Gordana Uzelac, Gordana, of London Met. We're going to be starting in a moment. Just a couple of admin notes as ever at the start. The call for papers for the ASEN conference is out now. The conference is on nationalism and borders and is taking place next year at Central European University in Budapest. We've announced the first speaker is none other than Maya Tudor, and we're going to be announcing the other speakers over the next few weeks. So do stay tuned to our social media and website at asen.ac.uk for more information on that and on everything else that we are up to. So, nationalism and COVID. I will just point everybody, if you go to the front page of the ASEN website, asen.ac.uk, and click on the event page, the four papers we're talking about are linked there. So do go and take a look, and you can read them at your leisure afterwards. So I'm very glad we've already got quite a few people in Facebook, YouTube, and so on. Because I was slightly worried what the algorithm would do when we wanted to do an event about nationalism, COVID, and conspiracy theories. But it does all seem to be working. Whichever platform you're watching us on, if you've got any questions, do put them in the chat, and I will ask them of the panelists. I think without any further ado, I'll hand over to Siniša. Siniša, all yours.
Okay, thanks very much, David, for organizing this event and for inviting us. And I know people, have focused now on many other things. There are so many tragedies and wars that have taken place in the last 4 years. So COVID might look like something that has taken, years ago that people don't pay attention. But I think there are some really interesting findings from our project that could tell us a little bit more about the way how nationalism and nation states operate in times of crisis. So I'll just say a few words about our project, and then each of us will talk about different aspects of this project, focusing on these four papers that we have published already. So the project is called World Problem, National Solutions, the Impact of National Past on Behavior During the Pandemic. It was funded by the Irish Health Board and SFI. And it was conducted during the COVID, so we couldn't do the face-to-face survey. We had to engage Ipsos from Geneva, and they recruited respondents via online access panels in 5 countries. So we decided to do this on 5 countries that had very different policies during the COVID in terms of lockdowns, in terms of kind of mobility, in terms of vaccinations and many other things. So our focus has been on England, Germany, Sweden, Ireland, and Serbia. The sampling frame that was used was based on national statistics from the most recent censuses in each of these 5 countries. The quota sample was used. That is the representative in terms of age, gender, region, education in all 5 countries. So we had a survey designed with 31 questions and number of open questions as well. So the field work was completed from 8th to 30th of March 21 on a sample of 7,000 respondents in these 5 countries, with 2,000 from large countries like England and Germany. We didn't do the UK, we did England because there were different policies in Scotland and Wales and Northern Ireland, and 1,000 in smaller countries like Sweden, Serbia, and Ireland. So much of our data combines both quantitative and qualitative, as you will see. I will focus now on one aspect of the project, which is essentially links between nationalism and conspiracy theories. What we wanted to find out is how the intensity and character of different beliefs in conspiracy theories was spread, what was throughout these 5 countries, what were the dominant kind of social profiles of conspiracy theorists, and how this was linked with nationalism. So the commitment to conspiracy theories was how deep it was linked with different forms of conspiracy theory. So we're really interested in different nationalist perspectives that were dominant at the time when the survey was conducted. So we don't have much time. Each of us has about 10 minutes, and we can later focus maybe on some specific questions. But what we wanted to find out essentially is to explore a little bit how conspiracy theories, operate in the context of such a kind of ongoing pandemic, and what is their link with nationalism. So in that context, social context is very important, and two issues were particularly relevant for this project. One issue is which we can call Weberian context. This is essentially the importance of state and the ability of state to monopolize the use of violence, legitimate use of violence over its territory. So we could see how in times of a pandemic, the states demonstrate very quickly this coercive power, this coercive capacity. They were able to close borders. They were able to limit mobility to 2 kilometers, 5 kilometers in some places. They were able to introduce different lockdown rules in different nation states. They were, in a way, also prioritizing their own citizens in terms of health equipment. In the early days of pandemic, there was a scramble really for these different health equipment that was necessary at that time. Later on, when vaccines were created, there was another struggle in prioritizing one's own citizens in terms of who will get better vaccines and more vaccines and things like that. In all of these cases, we could see this Weberian element of power of the nation state, how nation states in times of crisis become so visible, so strong and coercive, but also have a legitimate backing because people are very much going along with this. And the second issue is, which we could call Durkheimian, is the way how nationalism becomes more visible, more prevalent on the bottom-up level in terms of everyday rituals, in terms of how kind of people start spontaneously or semi-spontaneously developing these rituals of solidarity, singing various patriotic songs from the balconies, like that was the case in Spain and Italy and China and other places. Also organized or spontaneously organized clapping for the medical workers, for the heroes in the UK, or the emphasizing examples of individuals who would show a degree of solidarity or sacrifice themselves for others, like that was the case with the Captain Tom walking, in his backyard for NHS and things like that. We have also kind of some private radio stations, like in Italy, broadcasting specific songs that were written during the COVID, again, to emphasize national solidarity and things like that. So these two contexts are really important because they do tell us a lot about importance of nationalism, centrality of nationalism in times of crisis, such as the pandemic. And then what was interesting to us is to see the links with the conspiracy theories. Obviously, conspiracy theories were very prevalent, throughout the COVID period, in part because people were isolated in their own homes and oriented to social media. So we have a lot of these kind of responses, people blaming others for pandemic, from Bill Gates and George Soros to 5G masks and, some groups like immigrants, Muslims, Jews, everybody else. So social media was very prevalent, very important. And here I'll show some, let me just see, slides. Sorry, it's been a while. So this is kind of the answer to the question on whether COVID virus has been artificially manufactured. Then we can see here, even though 44.6% people in all 5 countries didn't believe that, the large number of them did believe that, like 24.4% said yes, and around 30% were unsure. And here we see some of the groups that were identified as being responsible: China, US, George Soros, Muslims, scientists, and so on. What is interesting for us, and that's visible in throughout the project, is how Serbia stands out in terms of conspiracy theories. The answer in Serbia is over 80% of people believe that COVID has been artificially manufactured, which is much lower in other countries. Ireland is a bit high, close to 40%, but the rest is all around 20 or 30%. What's also interesting for us was to look a little bit at how, sorry, where did I leave? We were also looking at different forms of conspiracy theory. So we made a distinction between strong, medium, and mild forms of conspiracy theory. So the strong ones would be associated with specific individuals like Bill Gates and Soros, 5G mast, or something that obviously has no empirical backing whatsoever. Medium one would focus more on general, on some countries like US, Russia, Israel, scientists and things like that. And then the mild form of conspiracy theory is something that can have some links like capitalism or China, but there is no kind of scientifically proven causal link between these two. And then we've kind of linked that and did research with nationalist orientations, drawing on kind of existing scholarship in nationalism studies, identifying kind of different statements which would say something about national history, the role or function of nation, and these different national principles that Smith identified in order to generate different perspectives on nationalism. So I won't go into details here, but we can look at this later on. What we ended up with is that the four dominant nationalist orientations across these populations. One focusing on kind of a past and perceiving nation in a primordialist sense, as a nation. Our nation has always been there from time immemorial. So we have primordialism. Using factor analysis, we generated these different orientations. Primordialism is one of them. Nation-centric view of the world is another one. Then we have a kind of historical view of the nation. And we have a constructivist understanding of nation, where nation is perceived as a social construct. So I won't go and give you too much data here, but just kind of to look at each of these countries. What we ended up with is that in most cases, primordialism is linked strongly with conspiracy theories, with kind of intense form of conspiracy theory. And also in some instances, we also have the nation-centric view of the world linked with conspiracy theories, while constructivist understanding of the nation is not linked, obviously, in any way with conspiracy theories, which doesn't, it's not something to be, it's not a shocking, not surprising result, but it's useful results to see, how a strong version of conspiracy theory is very much linked with this nationalist, primordialist perception of the world. We also looked at kind of open-ended questions to see whether conspiracy theories appear there, and they do appear across different lines. We've also looked at the kind of different socio-demographic factors, gender, age, profession, religion, and we have identified two factors that appear throughout the whole 5 samples. In all cases, a strong version of conspiracy theories is linked with a strong sense of religious belief. So people who identify as being more religious or deeply religious tend to be more inclined to believe in strong version of conspiracy theory. And people who identify themselves as politically on the right or far right also tend to be more inclined to believe in strong version of conspiracy theory. We can see also that we were looking at sources of information, and we found that in all 5 cases, social media played an important role, but also some kind of local community, work colleagues. This is where the information was gathered. So this micro context, and Lea will talk a little bit more about this, notions of micro solidarity, how they were important in shaping this sense of conspiracy communities and that particular way of thinking about the world. Here we have a kind of just very briefly some quotes from the open answers, where you see how people perceive these who are inclined to believe in conspiracy theories, that they tend to blame their own governments or WHO or some individuals like Bill Gates and Soros, deep state, secret services, capitalism, but also immigrants and kind of that political divides that were present within societies are very much reflected in these answers. And we see that like in all countries, in Sweden as well, attack on migrant groups as being threats, and obviously it's very hard to make these links, how migrants have anything to do with the spread of a virus, Muslims, but also global elites and, generally Soros, Bill Gates, deep state, the usual things. In Ireland, we also see some kind of animosities, existing animosities in relation to British government have been reflected in some of these conspiracy theories, blaming, the English government, the British, but also the common, thing about World Bank and media and so on and so forth. In England, what we see is also attack on the opposition at that time, on Labour Party, Keir Starmer here, the EU, they were all identified as a woke mob, together with immigrants, minorities of any kind. So we see, again, a lot of this kind of far-right discourse prominent, appearing and being linked with conspiracy theories. In Serbia, the focus is very much on kind of NATO and US. They are perceived as the main enemy, and historically since War of 1999. So often we have individuals like Bill Gates and Soros, but they are perceived as being part of the US state and things like that. Okay, so just to conclude very briefly, and we can talk later on in the question time. What we have when we look at this relationship between conspiracy theories and nationalism, what comes across is that Serbia stands out from the rest of these countries because there is much more prevalent beliefs in conspiracy theories and kind of there's a really long list of open-end answers where we have for Serbia much more than for anybody else. But what's also interesting is that in other countries, a lot of people have expressed different versions of conspiratorial thinking. Not necessarily a strong version, but mild, kind of medium version is quite present throughout all five societies. We also see that primordialism is very strongly linked with a strong version of conspiracy theories, and in some instances like Germany, Sweden, and Serbia, we also have nation-centric view of the world, which is linked strongly with conspiracy theories. And the 2 points that I mentioned, in all five countries, we find very strong links between people who see themselves as highly religious and believe strongly in conspiracy theories, and the same is with the right-wing politics. Those who are inclined to be politically right-wing tend to be much more committed to a stronger version of conspiracy theory. Okay, I will stop here now and give floor to Sarah. And
thank you so much, Siniša. Give me 1 second. So we heard a lot about the national level now, but during the pandemic, the local level was very important for the solidarity as well. So we conducted a survey experiment within the project and as part of the survey, and looked at people's willingness to help their neighbors, especially if they are from a different ethno-religious origin, because you can imagine that during a crisis such as COVID-19, people hold even more resentments towards immigrants than they already hold. So when we talk about the willingness to help to improve someone else's well-being, then we also talk about pro-social attitudes, and there have been some studies on the topic itself, especially with regard to immigrants' eligibility to receive medical care, ICU beds, vaccination prioritization, etc. And most of them, they do find that immigrants are disadvantaged, especially if they have been residing in a country for a short time. But none of them really, or very few that are out there, looked at informal types of support, such as helping a neighbor with groceries, which is our scenario that I'm getting to in a few minutes. Just to say that some studies, especially of experimental nature, have seen that there was more hostility towards foreigners, and that's of course during a crisis very important. And minorities in the UK also reported to perceive less support. As Siniša has said, when we conducted the study, restrictions were still in place. In Ireland, it was still in complete lockdown. Other countries had restrictions in terms of travel or visiting venues, number of people in restaurants, etc. So it was still of relevance. The precise time slot was 19th of May to 8th of June 2021. Maybe just to add, like Siniša mentioned already, that we used online access panels, and we had a total sample of 7,000. That was a quota sample representative of gender, age, region, and education, and also weighted to achieve greater representativeness. And our survey experiment was pre-registered on OSF. So what exactly did we do? We described to participants a scenario, and especially the scenario of a 60-year-old neighbor in a neighborhood, and whose name was either Alexander or Mohammed. So Mohammed would signal the different ethno-religious origin, and Alexander is a name that occurs in all of the countries. And then we varied how long this person has lived in the country, less than a year, the past 10 years, or the entire life. And we explained that this neighbor was living alone and doesn't have many connections, but has to cocoon due to the risks that COVID-19 poses for his health, and that he's been struggling to get his groceries. So if you think back to the beginning of the pandemic, oftentimes the supermarkets were overwhelmed with requests and it was hard to book slots. So we wanted to know if people would be willing to pick up the groceries for that neighbor, and we varied whether it was just groceries or groceries and beer. We were a bit curious if people use the beer as a signal for unhealthy behavior and will refuse, or if they treat it maybe as a signal of assimilation in some of the countries where beer is very popular. So based on that scenario, people were supposed to rate their willingness to pick up the groceries that had been prepaid and had to be picked up from a supermarket very close by, and they could answer on a scale from 0 to 4 willing, indicating how willing they are to pick them up. Now, you could argue that people are more empathetic if they have been in that situation, if they had COVID and they had to isolate, and they would be more willing to help. But we find the opposite. So the red line signals that there is no difference between coefficients, that they are not significant. So if the line of the coefficient here, the dot crosses the red line, it's not significant. And for people who tested positive, we found that they're actually less empathetic, it seems. So they were less willing to help. And on the other hand, we thought people who have care responsibilities, who have other obligations, are employed, they will have less time. So it's based on a cost benefit scenario. However, there were no significant differences. People with kids were equally willing to pick up the groceries, and employment did not matter. What did matter, for instance, was if people located themselves on the political spectrum towards the right, they were less supportive, less willing to help those neighbors. And trust was very important as well. So the more trust people have, the more willing they are to engage in voluntary action as well. Now, descriptively, in Sinisha's case, Serbia stood out already. So it is also in this case. So you see that the higher the bar means the higher the willingness to help people. And in Serbia, it was the highest, the willingness to help. And in Sweden, surprisingly, the lowest. So now we can only speculate what the reasons are for that. Maybe the strengths of the welfare state, systems of like voluntary engagement that are in place might explain to some extent the country differences. I'm happy to discuss this further. The other countries were somewhere in between. Now, coming to our key variables. As you might guess, someone whose name is Mohammed, people would indicate a lower willingness to help him than someone named Alexander. And beer definitely doesn't increase one's chances to get help, no matter which ethno-religious origin, no matter in which country you are. So it really came down to the essentials. Now, the length of the residence of that neighbor, we saw that people who had just immigrated to the country, they were less popular in the sense that people were less willing to help them. And whether they lived there 10 years or their entire life, it didn't matter. But less than 1 year, it didn't matter. And thinking about the refugee stream that was happening at that time from Ukraine, this is a very problematic finding. Now, there were different combinations possible based on the groceries, the name, the length of the residence, and you would expect that everyone who has a name Alexander will be more popular and will be at the left end of the graph here. So again, the further left, the more willing people are to help that person. And towards the right, you would have all profile combinations with Mohammed, but that's not the case. So indeed, an Alexander who has lived there his entire life, just wanted groceries, no beer, would be the most popular or highest rated profile. So respondents received only one combination at a time. So, and Mohammed, who had just immigrated, so less than 1 year ago, and ordered beer, was the least popular. But you also see that, for instance, a Mohammed who has lived in the country for at least 10 years and wanted groceries, there was no significant difference to an Alexander, which means it's a bit more complex than just saying that the boundary runs along ethno-religious belonging. And lastly, we looked at the role of religiosity, especially if it comes to attitudes towards Muslims. You can imagine that people's own religiosity matters. So the more you would identify with your own religion, the more reluctant you would be maybe to help someone from another religion. That's the usual logic that we assume. But what we're seeing here is actually something quite counterintuitive, and we also see that it really varies across countries. So the lower line you can see here, this is Sweden, and the upper line in green, this is Serbia. And on the horizontal axis you see people's degree of religiosity, from not religious at all to very religious. And for Sweden, it's a decreasing line. Now, this means that the more religious people in Sweden are, the less willing the less willing they are to help. So it's a negative relationship. And normally, you also have this idea that, especially towards the in-group people who are religious, they are more pro-social, as many studies find. But we do not find this. So this religious group of people in Sweden seems to be a very particular group. And for Serbia, it's the opposite. The more religious, the more supportive they are. Now, what's interesting in this case is that there are no differences by origin. So it's the same for Alexander and it's the same for Mohammed, meaning religious people in those countries, they are either more willing to support Mohammed or Alexander, but it's not orthogonal in a sense. So we can conclude that especially those of minority origin who have spent less than a year in a country who are also the most vulnerable, they would receive help the least, unfortunately. And given that, if you think about the name Alexander now, it's a name that occurs in all of the countries, but it's also a name that could have that a Ukrainian refugee, for instance, could have carried. So there is this discrimination and attitudes towards people who are coming from elsewhere, especially if they are more recent immigrants. And we do see strong national differences, so local level matters, but national level matters for sure as well. And especially this ethnic factor, it mattered more so in Germany than in any other country. And there is definitely something that we could call pro-sociality chauvinism. So people are seen as only eligible even for informal help if they have resided in that country. Now, and I think this relationship between religion and the attitudes is quite interesting and a little bit counterintuitive, that it doesn't go in different directions for in-group and out-group members. Thank you so much for listening, and if you're interested, you're welcome to look up the results that were published in International Sociology this year.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Sarah. And the links to all the papers are on the website at asen.ac.uk. So I'll hand over to the one and only Lea David, talking about naked nations.
Okay.
Over to you.
Wait, can you see my slides?
We can't. They're just appearing now.
Okay, wait.
Yeah. Okay. We can see them now.
Just a second.
But I think
okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So we are talking about heroes and villains and the notion of naked nation. But actually, what am I going to talk today about is mostly about micro-solidarity and grounded nationalism in times of crisis. We actually make two arguments here. First is that the vast majority of answers show that heroes and villains are found in small groups encounters. However, in-group social solidarity is referential to the existing organizational and ideological power of the nation state. So, to start off with why heroes and villains, we know that actually both heroes and villains are well embedded in national mythology, so to say, and in a sense, heroes are the representatives of everything that is good in a nation, whereas villains is everything that is dirty, something that we don't want, impure, that we don't want to accept. So we thought it would be interesting to see during this crisis actually how people define those terms or those characters during the crisis. And here I want to say that when we say naked nation, though we talk about it both figuratively but also in an essential way, we are talking about this relational nature of micro-solidarity to the category of nation, and how this connection exposes the prevalent force of nationalism. So I'm going to focus on that one. Any second, I'm going to explain it. Methodology, okay, I'm not going to repeat it. The sample you know already, and when the research was done, also both Sarah and Siniša mentioned. I focused in this survey on those open-ended questions. So questions Q12A, Q12B. So the question 12 was, in your opinion, who should be remembered as heroes? That was question 12A. And then who should be remembered as villains? And everything was open for their answers. So it was an open question answer, but they could choose also to answer I don't know, or to leave it blank if they want. What was surprising here, and because this was not a per se statistical analysis, but it was thematic content analysis, where I actually took all those open answers, and you can imagine it was altogether more than 10,000 for both villains and heroes. We realized something very interesting that is happening there, that it was possible to actually make 3 different groups of those answers, and that those answers really correspond deeply with Malešević grounded nationalism theory. So it was not that we had some kind of plan to force it into it, just a sample, and the answers that we got actually fitted very well. So what is this grounded nationalism theory? So the idea is that we have 3 interconnected long-term historical processes that made nationalism the dominant operative ideology of modernity, and also the principal ideological discourse that legitimizes the existence and working of the nation state. The idea, and of course, if you have more questions about that, then just ask Professor Malešević, he's there. But the idea is that there are 3 historical processes intertwined together. One is organizational power, second is ideological power, and third is micro-solidarity. Organizational power means, all those institutions and organizations, like infrastructure that enables ideological power, which is kind of the content of nationalism. What? This is how and this is what. And then micro-solidarity is really necessary, because at the end of the day, this ideological and organizational power has to be embedded in, has to be internalized through people. So micro-solidarity is actually about encounters in small groups. Okay, so when we see what happens in those responses when they answer who is the hero or who are the heroes, we see here again first theme, which is this in blue, is about organizational power. It means that those people who answered governments or this institution, that institution, then this orange one is actually micro-solidarity. Those who actually said, well, the heroes are within our community. And the third one is this ideological power, which is much more about pointing out to some external factors in relation to your own nation. And here we see that in almost all those cases, with slight exception of England, actually the micro-solidarity factor was the most pronounced, in a sense that all of those nations, regardless of their differences, saw that actually heroes are within their nation. So in all 5 countries, the most common answer to asking who the heroes are is the people among us, or more precisely, the deserving segments of a society. So we see, for example, doctors and nurses, and those who develop the vaccine, epidemiologists, scientists in general, or to be more precise, key workers, medics, hospital staff, emergency services, medical professionals, frontline workers, etc., etc. However, in many other professions are named as well, as teachers, delivery drivers, pharmacists, dentists, supermarket workers, soldiers and military people, police, volunteers, charities, bus drivers, etc. So here I'm not entering the differences between countries, because I wanted to capture here something that is very common for all of them. So those answers you can find in all of those countries. Now, I'm here again focusing on micro-solidarity. In the article that we wrote, you can also have about organizational and ideological power and those answers there as well. Now, when we come to villains, again, we have those 3 themes, and we see here that, the bad guys, here the governmental organizations are much more prominent. However, we see also that micro-solidarity is really significant, especially in Ireland, in other places, for example, in Serbia, that we managed to see in those two previous papers that is contradictory in many ways. We see that government is to be blamed much more than the community itself. And here, when we talk about Williams and micro-solidarity or those anti-COVID people, we see three different answers. So first group of people are those who simply don't adhere to the given measures, So we will have answers like everyone who refuses to wear masks, so all the idiots who are putting the health of others at risk, those who are not taking the whole thing seriously, egoistic people, irresponsible people, selfish people, travelers, immigrants. So you see now you have different segments of society. Those between the age of 40 and 60, those who gather in large groups for entertainment, lockdown demonstrators, students, those who are having a party, etc., etc. Now, second group are those who are perceived to be profiting out of this COVID-19 crisis. So people making even more money out of this crisis, COVID profiteers, those who are lining their pockets on the back of others, etc. Again, all those answers you can see in all of those 5 countries. And the third group refers to people who actively advocated against COVID measures. So corona deniers, Trump supporters, lateral thinkers for Germany, people protesting against the epidemic measures, right-wing populists, etc., etc. Okay, so what is the link actually between micro-solidarity and the nation state that we see here? So we can analyze it and we can see it on 3 different levels. So first one is this direct interconnectedness of micro-solidarity with organizational and ideological power, meaning micro-solidarity alone should not be seen, nor the participants see it, in isolation of the nation state. So we see that most of the answers we got had more than one theme. So for example, someone would say the government is responsible for this, but also those who didn't behave properly. So those answers would be counted as 2 different themes. And we see that most of the answers had more than one theme. So we see actually how this issue of micro-solidarity is deeply linked with organizational and ideological power. The second indicator is something that we see in lots of those answers, is by saying my nation, our community, our country. So it is a dominant answer in all the countries. And the third one is great level of intimacy and strong emotions. So, people who are knowingly spreading lies in our community, conspiracy theorists among us, or, my doctor, our medics. But then again, we see this language of emotions as such. They're selfish, they're rotten, they're idiots, morons, liars. This emotional investment actually shows this high link between micro-solidarity and the nation state. And to conclude, this research suggests that even though the pandemic was a global phenomenon, people's perceptions of heroes and villains were ultimately underpinned by the contemporary nation state. Nation states and their own nation acted constantly as the main point of reference when imagining heroes and villains, revealing the strength of the internalization of this grounded nationalism. So micro-solidarity attachments are tightly linked with and referential to nation state, and people internalize nationalism, making this category of nation inseparable of selfhood. And that is actually the most important thing. People were not able to think during this crisis apart or separately from their placement in the nation. And that is very important, because the internalization of nationalism at the bottom-up levels leaves little or no space for reimagining global connectedness. Although we've seen some kind of global linkages here and there was no real imagination of appreciating this crisis through the lenses of humanity, for example. It was all through the lenses or in relation to my own nation. Thank you.
Fabulous. Thank you. Well, thank you very much, Lea. And we'll hand over to Gordana on vaccine nationalism. Gordana, take it away.
Thank you very much. Let me just start this slideshow. Good evening, and thank you very much for being here with us. And David, thank you very much for organizing this. You will be all happy to hear that this is the last presentation in the panel. And it's a little bit different because, unlike previous, this one focuses on only one country. And we had, we think we had a quite good rationale for it. I will start with the timeline. And if you are like me, and all this time of COVID seems a little bit fuzzy as it happened so long ago, I thought maybe it was a good idea to start this discussion with a little reminder of when things happen. For this presentation and my topic on vaccine nationalism, it's important to note that in United Kingdom, the first vaccine is administered in 2020, December 2020. Only about a month after that, first vaccine was administered in the European Union. But 6 months prior to that, at the time when there was still no vaccine for COVID, high-income countries, which is about 30% of the global population, had placed orders for more than half of the projected available doses. UK was one of the largest per capita buyer of vaccines, and it pre-ordered 340 million doses, which would be 5 doses per citizen. A year after the first administration in the UK, in November 2021, 63% of the population of high-income countries were fully vaccinated, and compare that to just 1.4% of low-income countries. This disparity, this time gap between actual purchase of the vaccine and administration of the vaccine is what we usually refer to as vaccine nationalism. I take this van der Slot's definition of vaccine nationalism, which says that it's actually a pursuit of vaccines in the national interest, for example, through supply agreements or export bans, including where this might be to the detriment of other countries. I particularly like Bollick's and Bound's definition, which more or less just see vaccine nationalism simply as my country first approach. However, if you at that time looked at the discussions about vaccine nationalism, you would see that vaccine nationalism does not only include references to nations, national governments, and so on. There is a whole range of agencies that were included in vaccine nationalism. Yes, indeed, the leaders of that were political governments of the nations and so on, but we also have seen accusations of vaccine nationalism from supranational organizations like European Union, or through big multinational companies, pharmaceutical companies, big pharmas like Serum in India, where one of the managing directors said that or at a certain period of time, all production of that company will go to India itself. Of course, there is the public played its own role in expressing certain inclinations towards vaccine nationalism. And that was one of the main reasons why we dedicated several questions in our survey to examine to which extent populations of these 5 countries express some form of vaccine nationalism. There was a question when we asked, with the limited availability of the COVID-19 vaccine, and by the way, we had, I don't know if you recall, we collected data somewhere in the March, April, May period of 2021. So we asked these respondents whether their country should get the vaccine either before any other nation or before neighboring countries, or at the same time as other in Europe, or at the same time as other in the world. Now, with a certain recoding of these answers, we considered that these 2 options, before any other nation and before neighboring countries, would signify certain level of, or certain inclinations towards vaccine nationalism, while at the same time as others in Europe and at the same time as others in the world would be an indicator of no vaccine nationalism. When recoded, these are the results for each individual country. Analysis shows that England shows a statistically significant difference in view or expression of vaccine nationalism in comparison to other countries. That is the only one that actually about 1/3 of the respondents show some inclination towards something that we could call vaccine nationalism. For that reason, our attention turned towards a case of England. We wanted to know to which extent adult population in England supports views that can be seen as vaccine nationalism, but also much more important for us is what are the main factors that contribute to the expression of such views. Now, we started with 4 hypotheses in our data analysis that came from the most dominant debate about vaccine nationalism at that time. We identified 4 main issues that were related to issues of vaccine nationalism. One of them is medical, where all kinds of experts were telling us how problem of pandemic cannot be sorted out, of course, within the national borders, that the problem is global, and hence that vaccine nationalism only serves the virus itself. Therefore, we kind of assumed that respondents who had more serious personal experience of the pandemic and who are more vulnerable to virus might be more likely to express some level of vaccine nationalism. Second issue was quite often mentioned regarding vaccine nationalism is issue of security, especially after the so-called H1N1 virus and pandemic of, we know it as a swine flu. There was lots of discussion about the, if you want, like virus used as a weapon, a weaponized biological war, and how nations should be prepared to defend themselves not only in the military level, but also on the level of health, on the vaccines. So we thought that those respondents who might hold that their nation is threatened by other nations at some time might be more likely to express some level of vaccine nationalism as well. The third debate, which was quite extensive debate, was ethical debate. Is vaccine nationalism good, bad, and why? It is interesting to read these debates that happened at that time, because there was absolutely no person who claimed that vaccine nationalism is good. However, there is also interesting to see that a great majority of debates claim that it is understandable, but also that national governments owe loyalty to their nations. Therefore, the ethical issue is not whether national governments should secure vaccines for their nations, but what to do and how to fairly distribute the access of vaccines. Therefore, we thought that those kind of view, the respondents who are more attached to nationalist ideology, to the nation, might be more likely to express some level of vaccine nationalism. Finally, There was also lots of debate about how vaccine became a symbol of national achievement, something that certain nations, or actually all vaccines, were labeled as belonging to certain communities. So we had the Russian, we had British, Swedish, and so on vaccine. So it's not just a vaccine, it became very nationalized in a sense. So we thought that maybe respondents who express more pride in the achievement of their nation will be more likely to express some level of vaccine nationalism. So I'm going to now show you the results. We did a series of so-called logistic regressions where dependent variable was that vaccine nationalism, whether there is some expression or no expression of vaccine nationalism. Rather than bother you with numbers, the whole idea here, I'm going to show you the so-called significant impact of different predictors or different characteristics or criteria. And very generally, if the number here is negative, it means higher inclination or more likely to express no vaccine nationalism. If it is a positive number, it would be some or more likely to express some form of vaccine nationalism. So in order to test the first hypothesis, we put here some general sociodemographic characteristics, but also experiences, personal experiences of COVID of respondents, thinking that more vulnerable respondents would be those who will express some form of vaccine nationalism. It was, in a sense, a surprise to note that personal experience of COVID, whether somebody tested positive, whether a respondent knows someone who died, or whether a respondent belongs to something that will be called the risk group, has absolutely no effect on expression of vaccine nationalism. So very clearly, we could reject our first hypothesis that vaccine nationalism is expression of some kind of vulnerability, of health vulnerability. Now, following from that, we looked at other three hypotheses. I'm going to take you a step by step. Only some of these criteria turn out as significant predictors of vaccine nationalism. When we talk about security issue, the results show that how we phrased our hypothesis as vaccine nationalism as express of kind of perceived threat from other nations has to be taken with a little bit of kind of called pinch of salt. Mainly because a variable that expresses a direct kind of fear of threat of other nations during the COVID did show as statistically significant, but on a basic level of significance, a very weak predictor. That's the reason why we have to take it with caution. However, we did find here that those respondents who think that their nation is more dependent on other nations in a time of COVID crisis, that they will be more likely not to express any form of nationalism. Now, when a third hypothesis about the ethical issue of vaccine nationalism is in question, one of the first things that you can see is that nationalist ideology has no impact on expression of vaccine nationalism. It's only one variable, issue of loyalty, that turn as significant predictor, but that is very weak significant predictor as well. So we can say that the effect of nationalism as an ideology must be really taken with caution when we talk about vaccine nationalism. However, there is a political identities impact here, where political orientation from left to right is actually a significant predictor, and those respondents who place themselves more towards the right side of the political orientation or line are more likely to show some inclination towards vaccine nationalism. Finally, the last fourth hypothesis actually is the only one that we can accept with certain level of certainty, because it is also the strongest, two strongest predictors in this model, where pride in national achievement shows that there is some inclination towards vaccine nationalism. So in this case, we can see, that we have to be very careful. We are talking about the concept of vaccine nationalism in the first place. Results show that vaccine nationalism among the population of England has to be really carefully examined. Indeed, our respondents in England show the highest level of expression of vaccine nationalism, but at the same time, we can, with certain certainty, see it as expression of a symbol of national state or state achievement. Here, the population expressed the pride in their scientists, in their pharmaceutical companies, in their government that are perceived as ours. Now, we do know how, mostly talking about the so-called AstraZeneca vaccine, and how it is perceived and presented as very much national achievement, even though we know much better how the whole vaccine is funded, how it was kind of created, procured, and so on. But here, more importantly, it's the perception of the population that that particular vaccine is ours, and hence we deserve to be first to receive that vaccine, as it is kind of a product of our own achievement. Now, so here, vaccine nationalism among the population has to be taken with caution. However, when we are talking about the government of the UK, we can clearly see that they express very much, put their interest of their citizens first. Well, on the other hand, I guess that is the true not only when vaccines are in question, but absolutely all resources, from energy resources and so on, and any other resources, that all governments will prioritize their own populations. Mostly because vaccine nationalism, in our view, is not necessarily an expression of nationalism as ideology, but a measure of state power, with both domestically and internationally. Now, it is also interesting, and I'll finish with that, with a quote from Boris Johnson, then Prime Minister of Britain, who apparently in on the Zoom meetings somewhere in March 2020, claimed how, 2021, I guess, said the reason we have vaccine success is because of capitalism, because of greed, my friends. So I wonder to which extent we can talk about vaccine nationalism, or whether we should talk about vaccine capitalism. Thank you very much for your attention.
Well, thank you, Gordana. Thank you all very much. I mean, very appropriate to end with Boris Johnson and talking about vaccine nationalism, given that in his forthcoming memoirs, he apparently says that when he was Prime Minister, he considered a military raid on the Netherlands to take back the vaccine from a warehouse there. Probably best not to dwell on that particular one. If people out there on the interwebs have any questions, do please put them on Facebook, YouTube, Zoom, whichever platform you're on. But I'm going to kick things off, if I may, with a question. I seem to remember, if we go back a little bit, everything was talking about globalization and the end of the nation state, and then COVID. Now, all of a sudden, nationalism seems to be everywhere. So, did COVID save the nation state?
Who do you want to respond?
Whoever wants to jump in first.
Yeah, but I mean, you can say that the power of nation state is always revealed in times of crisis. So that could be war, and that could be pandemic, that could be some other natural disaster. So yes, I mean, in that respect, pandemic did help both at this level of kind of enhancing the coercive capacity of the state, giving power to state in the economy as well. In a sense, states made decisions how to allocate budgets, to keep people employed and paid, even though they stayed at home, many of them. and also at that level of a social cohesion. So you have that element that people felt, okay, we need to be we are all under threat. We need to show a degree of solidarity. So that's, I think, very much the case. All big crises do that. They enhance nationalism and they increase the power of the nation state.
Lea.
Yeah, but in a sense, it is actually why we call it naked nations, because it was always there. Nationalism is there, but it gave us this opportunity to see how embedded it, in a sense that it is not, just top down. People are actually internalizing those categories, and they cannot see reality other than through those lenses. So this is, I think, something to keep in mind.
Well, and so not just that nationalism was always there, but it's actually it's not just there as a resource people can draw on, but it's, if you like, it's the only resource. It's the only way people can see the world when you get to that time of crisis. Yeah, it's I don't know. It's a fascinating one. Just a comment someone's put through: the Cuban vaccine was apparently called Soberanía, sovereignty, which seems like a good name. I've got a question here, actually specifically for Siniša, but I think possibly for everyone. Why does Serbia stand out so much?
Yeah. Okay. So that is a question that we were all puzzled by. In some respects, it has to do that Serbia is the only kind of post-communist country in our sample. So it has a little bit different pattern of. You can see from other research results from other projects that these European countries have a higher level of conspiracy theories, for example, than in other places. But also Serbia has, variety of things that, like legacy of the war, played, in the Yugoslav wars, NATO bombing. It is something that has been constantly reinforced in the mass media. And also the government plays with this constantly. So in a sense, there is this, Lea is doing actually research on this more extensively, this legacy of conspiratorial thinking and magical thinking has a strong legacy in Serbia now for more than 30 years. So she might, add to this.
It is interesting. We don't have all the facts puzzled there, but there is something about those historical legacies actually there. And what we see from different results and from different papers, so we see on the one hand that, in a paper that I presented, that, for example, there is, when we talk about villains, we are talking about government. It is very pronounced in Serbia that those are the bad people. But when we talk about solidarity, as Sarah was talking about, then we see that there is much more communal attitude there, in a sense that, okay, we cannot trust the government, so we need to do it by ourselves. So there is a much stronger focus on a community at some level. And then to go again back to this background of wars and social and economic instability, and to add that there is porous ground or fertile ground for all kinds of miracles and wonders that are happening there, but that is completely different topic. There is something there that is very acceptable for conspiracy theories on the one hand, but on the other hand, like taking things in their own hands and doing it within the community.
Gordana.
Yeah, I would like to add something to it, and exceptionalism of Serbian case, but the other way, a little bit more different. Serbia was amazing in playing so-called vaccine diplomacy game at this time. At the time when England managed to administrate most of the vaccines, Serbia was second highest in the world of administrating by proportion of their population. It played very interestingly the game of its geopolitical position and its inclination of standing between ally of Russia and China and ally of European Union. it kind of accused European Union for neglecting those small nations and played some kind of ethical or guilt game with the European Union, but at the same time received a relatively huge number of vaccines from Russia and from China. So it is also the country that actually had the lowest percentage of population of these five that did administer a vaccine. Only about 50% of half of the population expressed the willingness to take vaccine in the first place, and even smaller percentage actually took vaccine there. But it is interesting that this, on this political level, the nationalism there played quite interesting role of natural inclination, international relations towards Russia and, as we know, China, playing it against the interests of European Union. And I think that was also quite exceptional, different than other nations in this context.
Thank you. I'm going to take a question from Claudia on Zoom. In the case of Germany, was there a difference in response between the former East and the West? No. So that's a 9. Gordana, you're yeah.
No, I don't think we didn't check. We didn't play. There was the amount of data was such that we just had to select what kind of analysis will be conducted. We do have regional, a division of respondents according to region, but not sure whether they have it as such as East-West division. So I cannot tell because I personally haven't seen data on that.
No,
Something
it's a very
to build.
good point. But yeah, we could technically do the analysis of that.
Yeah, no, it'd be interesting to see if there's a post-communist effect. But Sarah, what we've got, I did want to ask about Sweden, if I may. That Sweden sort of stuck out for being low on sort of willingness to help others. And you mentioning about, is that a function of the strong welfare state or something else? Because the assumption would be that the sort of all those lovely Scandinavians should all be being lovely to each other. So what's going on there?
Yeah, we can only speculate about that. Unfortunately, I think there is a possibility that in Sweden, people think that there are structures in place who can fulfill these things. Like we see internationally, they have a lot of voluntary engagement. The welfare state is quite strong. And Serbia is the opposite case in a way. So, but there we see that people are much more willing to help and relying on each other. So, yeah, it could possibly be the presence of alternative structures that people have available.
And a reliance on the state. I'll take a question from Chatham, which is a broader one. In your opinions, has COVID damaged the reputation of the EU, given that the idea of the lack of borders within the EU proved to be useless when it came to a health crisis?
Should I respond?
Go for it.
Yeah, I mean, initially, I think it did, in a sense, because there was no common policy when everything started. There was kind of immediate response was a national response, and it took a while for EU to kind of organize themselves as a sort of united policy. But it was always nation states were dominant in terms. You could see throughout the crisis that the nation states made decisions themselves, on lockdowns, on closing down the borders, and later on with the vaccine. Okay, there was some element of coordination across EU, but still nation states have become much more visible, and that is not unusual. This always happens in times of crisis. I mean, with the migration crisis, we could see how Schengen rules were quickly abandoned on the part of some states, and the borders were reintroduced. So I mean that is the character of a EU is not a nation state. It is an attempt of holding some common interests together in terms of trade and policies, but in times of crisis, nation states seem to be much more visible in that respect.
Gordana.
Yeah, I mean, I just passed my mind that, and something to also keep in mind, that different states have different organizational kind of solutions to this crisis. First of all, in the United Kingdom, in Scotland and Northern Ireland, the health as an issue is devolved, and Scottish and Northern Ireland governments were responsible for many issues related to COVID. And if I understood correctly, this very similar thing happened in Germany, and federal states were making decisions about certain measures to do. So it's not only that supranational organizations like European Union had to kind of deal with a crisis now on a kind of general or on a level above nation state. But there was also a problem of how do you deal with a crisis on lower than nation state level. And there were, as we know, both in Germany and in the United Kingdom, issues of lack sometimes of coordination of the governments or those responsible of contradictory decisions that were made and things like that. So I think that both above national, supranational, and under this nation state organization kind of were tested during this crisis.
Yeah, I mean, I certainly just from the UK experience, which was where I was during COVID, with family in Wales, but I was in England. The differences were actually, lockdowns happening in different times and different rules. Where I mean, and some of it was sort of basic things like you could go out when the lockdown was really tight. You could go out for an hour's exercise. I could basically get on my bike and where I wanted. My uncle in Cardiff could only go so far in one direction because that would take him into the next municipality, which you weren't allowed to do. And like that what are the rules was a real issue, and it did vary quite a lot. I wanted to ask, if I may, a slightly annoying methodological question, or maybe not annoying. You're using online panels. Is there a risk there, particularly during COVID, that you got the highly online? Because it's not a very accurate way of doing it, but you do get people who spend far too much time online, who then go down the conspiracy theory rabbit hole. We're familiar with people the stories about my grandfather started being on Facebook and now he's a mad Trump supporter, and we all saw conspiracy theories going around on about COVID. Certainly on my WhatsApp groups, there were loads of things going around, but that may just be my people in my orbit. Do you think there's a problem, a particular problem there about doing an online panel during COVID?
I would nominate Sarah for this to answer this question, but I would say, well, they should cycle more rather than being on the internet. But yeah, I think Sarah could answer some of these methodological questions. Do you want, Sarah?
Yeah, I mean, there are always biases, especially for the older generation, that you can find. But for instance, for Serbia, that was a group that was really hard to reach, if I recall correctly, like older people on the countryside. So they recruited for the panel to get a bigger diversity in there. So hopefully it's covering different segments of society as well. Because it's the use of online of internet is very different in different countries, differences based on the population size, spread of internet, etc. Did I answer your question?
Just to say, the Ipsos Geneva, they have their own panels. You know, these are established panels they use. So these are not collected just for this project. They do this systematically, you know, from year to year. So if there are any faults in that respect, they are to blame.
Our hands are clean. But we do have to say that you have to kind of wait between benefits of accessing some data during the pandemic and lockdown, rather than after, waiting for it to happen. And the fact that not everybody is online. But I think we are, as Sarah said, we are aware of the bias, but there was absolutely no other way to access any data at this particular time.
Yeah. And I mean, it seems strange now. I was really glad when you put up the timeline, Gordana, because it feels like a different lifetime. It's like, oh no, that was like 3-4 years ago, and it seems so far away. We're sort of pretty much out of time, so I'll just go around. Does anybody want to have any sort of last words, last thoughts? Lea?
I just made a face because the last thought sounds so dramatic, so I will cut. No, I don't have last. Okay. I have much more thoughts in future, but not now. Thank you.
Well, you're on mute, Siniša.
Right, just to thank you again for organizing the whole thing, you know, inviting us.
No, thank you very much for coming on. The papers are all linked from the ASEN website. So if you go to asen.ac.uk, and click on the front page where the events are, the papers are all linked there. So thank you to Gordana, to Sarah, to Lea, to Siniša, all for coming on. And as I said at the start, the call for papers for next year's ASEN conference on nationalism and borders is out now. It's on our website as well, being held at Central European University in Budapest. Any questions, do shoot us an email, asen@asen.ac.uk. And with that, thank you all very much.
Thank you.
Hey, my love.